Okay, well, over the last month, we've been journeying together at church through the book of Judges. And you probably remember that the whole idea is that we're looking at it through the eyes of the Israelites. So it was written about 3,000 years ago. So what were the Israelites 3,000 years ago? What were they getting from this? How did they view the book of Judges? What did they learn from it? And we're looking at that for firstly two reasons. One, because Judges is very much similar to the walk of a disciple today. So they have these great highs, they have these great lows, this time of great obedience, these times of great disobedience, which is very similar to what many people, it resonates with a lot of Christians today and how they live their lives as disciples. Sometimes life is good and sometimes it's not. Sometimes they feel faithful and sometimes they don't. In addition to that, we know that the book of Judges, the people of God had the book of Judges for about 1,000 years before Jesus came. And clearly it was of value to them just in its own right. It doesn't have to be read with any particular view that there's a New Testament meaning in there. They clearly got a lot of life lessons out of it. So they learnt lessons the hard way, and we're trying to learn some of those lessons, thankfully, from their expense and not ours. And you may remember that the pattern in Judges is a pretty constant one. So the people rebel against God. There's an oppressor that comes in and oppresses the people. They cry out to him. He then raises up from within the Israelites a judge or a deliverer who is raised up, and then they defeat whoever the people are that are oppressing them, and then there's peace, and the judge sort of presides over that peace. That's the flow all through Judges. This is the way it flows all the way along. And if you remember that at the moment, where we've got so far is we had a look at the gradual decline in leadership. So we had Ehud, who was a judge who just decided to do his own thing and make it in his way, a great consequence to everyone around him and to himself. And then we had a look at even someone who refused God's call to be a judge, Barak, and how he refused to take that particular call of life. And then, of course, last week we had a look at the first part of Gideon. We looked at Gideon's call and how God himself came down and called Gideon, who was a bit of a nobody, to be honest. He was the youngest member, as we know, of a lesser family within one of the lesser tribes in Israel. He's a bit of a nobody, and his family were a bunch of nobodies. In fact, they were idol-worshipping heathens, is where he's come from. And God gives Gideon a command. He says to them, go with the strength you have and rescue Israel from the Midianites. And when Gideon objects to that, the Lord says to him, I will be with you, and you will destroy the Midianites as if you were fighting against one man. Okay, so that's the call of Gideon and the command we talked about last week. Okay. So let's summarise what happens shortly after that. We can't do all of it. The account of Gideon's a big one, so I'm going to give you the expedited version on what happens shortly after that. So Gideon is not going to believe God necessarily to his word, so he asks him for a sign after he's been called. And so he says, all right, and he presents the sacrifice to God, and God self-immolates it. Self-immolates means that the sacrifice itself burns up all on its own. So basically the burnt offering is burnt. I mean, God does it, of course. But without any external agency, the thing burns up. There's this sign of the self-immolating sacrifice. Bang, it gets burnt up. And then God gives Gideon a practice job. He says, all right, we'll give you a bit of a practice job. I want you to go and take down your family's idols. And so once again, Gideon's not too sure that that's a great idea. So he does it at night where it can be, he's not going to be discovered. But he's found out God has an annoying way of doing that sometimes. So he gets found out, and surprisingly, his bunch of, backward heathen family back him. And as a result, he gets a lot of fame out of that, and he even gets a cool new name, and things are going pretty well for Gideon. But then, unfortunately, the Midianites team up again with their allies, and they come in and they invade Israel again. And this time, poor old Gideon can't get away from it. You see, he's managed to stay out of their way so far. He's like the most reticent military leader in the history of the world that's managed to avoid conflict up until this point. And if you have a look at this slide, you'll see that unfortunately for Gideon, they're doing a right-hand turn now, and they're coming up the Jezreel plain. So you might remember, normally they would go all the way down through the centre of Israel. They'd come from the north east, and they'd come down and they'd stop at the sea, cut straight down through the middle. They'd stop at Gaza at the sea, about that far. But this time, they've hung a bit of a right, and they're coming up the valley of Jezreel, which is right at Gideon. So they're coming right up at his location. So he calls out the soldiers from the northern tribes, the ones who are going to be most affected by this. It's probably easiest to call them out. So he calls them out, and bizarrely enough, they come. I mean, this is at the call of a know-nothing called Gideon, of course, although he does have a cool new name now. And then he has another attack of the doubts, and so he says to God, show me a sign if you're really serious about this. And we have what's known as the sign of the fleece. In fact, you might have heard that it's a bit of a byword. You hear someone will say, you've got to throw out a fleece. And so that comes from Gideon and the story of Gideon, where he says, God, if this is real, if you're really serious, then I'll put out a fleece tonight, and if it's wet and the ground around it is dry, then I'll know you're serious, which of course it is. So he says, all right, hang on, let's try that in reverse, just in case it was a strange sort of meteorological event. And so God says, fine, and they do it in reverse, and this time the ground is wet, the fleece is dry, and you can almost hear Gideon say, drat, because he can't avoid it. God's basically answered his sign, and so reluctantly Gideon grabs the soldiers there from northern Israel, and this is where we're going to pick up the story now. So, this is from Judges chapter 7, starting in verse 1. So Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, that's his cool new name now, and his army got up early and went as far as the spring of Harod. The armies of Midian were camped north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. The Lord said to Gideon, you have too many warriors with you. If I let all of you fight the Midianites, the Israelites will boast to me that they saved themselves by their own strength. Therefore tell the people, whoever is timid or afraid may leave this mountain and go home. So 22,000 of them went home. That's not a good command to give, leaving only 10,000 who were willing to fight. But the Lord told Gideon, there are still too many. Bring them down to the spring, and I'll test them to determine who will go with you and who will not. When Gideon took his warriors down to the water, the Lord told him, divide the men into two groups. In one group, put all those who cup water in their hands and lap it up with their tongues like dogs. In the other group, put all those who kneel down and drink with their mouths in the stream. Only 300 of the men drank from their hands. All the others got down on their knees and drank with their mouths in the stream. The Lord told Gideon, with these 300 men I'll rescue you and give you victory over the Midianites. Send all the others home. So, if you have a look at the next slide, you'll see where the Jezreel Valley is. So it's basically in that part of Israel, or on the corner of a couple of the. It's basically in the tribe of Manasseh's area, but clearly you can see it's bordering along with a couple of the others, and it's just south of where Gideon's new family home in Ophrah is. Now, they're at a place called, as you read there, the Spring of Harod. And Harod is an interesting name. In Hebrew, it means trembling. So they are at the Spring of Trembling, which is sort of quite ironic, really, considering 2/3 of them packed up and went home because they were scared. And the Midianites are spread out in this huge camp north of the Israelites. So when you actually go and you map this out, you realise that actually, based on the size of the Midianite and the Amalekite and the people of the East Horde, they would have taken up most of the valley, in the Jezreel Valley, which, by the way, is a big valley. They would have taken it up, and their forward positions were on the hill of Moreh, which is a few miles from these springs, the Springs of Trembling. Now, Moreh in Hebrew, which of course you'd know if you were listening to this 3,000 years ago, it means oracle. What's an oracle? Well, an oracle is a personal thing who sees God's purposes. That's what an oracle is. It's not what you see in the Matrix movie or any of those things, right? That's the purpose. It's not a word that's a Christian word. It's I suppose you'd say, a religious word. It's a word that all religions use. The oracle means to see God's purposes, or a personal thing that does that. So in this case, the hill of Moreh would mean the hill where God's purposes can be seen. It wasn't that the hill was seeing God's purposes clearly. The whole idea is that from this hill you can see God's purposes. Now, if you're hearing this account 3,000 years ago, the name Moreh would have had a particular special meaning for you. You see, when Abraham first came into the land of Canaan, which was to become Israel, the promised land, when he first came in, he stopped and just near Gilgal, and when he's there, the Lord appears to him, and the Lord shows him the land that he's going to inherit, he and his ancestors, and he shows him what his purposes are. He basically says, you're going to be a big people, this is going to be your land, you and your descendants are going to have this land. And he presents this to him, and you can guess, can't you, what that place is called? That place is called Moreh. Okay, so it's a place of immense significance to the Israelite people. It's still a place of immense significance to the Jews today, because that was where Abraham first had God show to him and say, this is your land. So you can imagine at the moment in Israel, when it comes to things like, the disputes over lands with the Palestinians and all that sort of stuff, at Moreh, there is a very small, it's in the Palestinian territories, but right in the middle of it, there's a very small Israelite camp that's placed right on the top of what is modern-day Moriah, because they aren't giving that up. That's the place where God came to them and revealed that all that land belonged to them. They're happy to give it all up, but there's a small settlement right in the middle of Moriah. It's a place of immense importance. So you can imagine when you're hearing this and you're an Israelite and you hear it's the hill of Moriah, you'd instantly be going, aha, there's something significant is going to happen here. There's no coincidence that God has put the Midianites at the hill of Moriah. Okay, we're going to get into that a little bit later. So, but you know the background. So God's, as we saw, he whittles down the army. To be honest, it's a bit of a joke. He's gone from 32,000 to 300. And you can imagine the logistics guys, I think that's great. But as a general rule, all the military planners are thinking, my options have been reduced somewhat, considering I'm now going to fight an army that fills most of the valley of Jezreel. That's the plan. Now, these 300 were probably good guys. Bear in mind, they were the ones who were left after all the people who were a bit worried went home. And then he kept them. They're probably a pretty disciplined group. The 300 aren't a bunch of idiots. It's not like God chose the 300 worst soldiers and gave it to Gideon. They're pretty good guys. But you've got to ask the question, don't you? Why doesn't God just make this easy? Poor Gideon's struggling as it is. Why wouldn't God just let him have his 32,000? They're already outnumbered anyway. To at least take the 32,000 and have a crack with the 32,000. Why make it harder? Why continually make it harder for Gideon? Well, it shouldn't surprise us then that Gideon gets another attack of the doubts. Because clearly now he's got 300 guys, good guys, but only 300. And this is what we hear in Judges chapter 7, starting in verse 8. So Gideon collected the provisions and ram's horns of the other warriors and sent them home. But he kept the 300 men with him. The Midianite camp was in the valley just below Gideon. That night the Lord said, "Get up, go down into the Midianite camp, for I have given you victory over them. But if you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah, listen to what the Midianites are saying, and you'll be greatly encouraged. Then you'll be eager to attack." So Gideon took Purah and went down to the edge of the enemy camp. The armies of Midian, Amalek, and the people of the east had settled in the valley like a swarm of locusts. Their camels were like grains of sand on the seashore, too many to count. Gideon crept up just as a man was telling his companion about a dream. The man said, "I had this dream, and in my dream a loaf of barley bread came tumbling down into the Midian camp. It hit a tent, turned it over, and knocked it flat." His companion answered, "Your dream can only mean one thing. God has given Gideon, son of Joash the Israelite, victory over Midian and all its allies." When Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he bowed and worshipped before the Lord. Then he returned to the Israelite camp and shouted, "Get up, for the Lord has given you victory over the Midianite hordes." All right, well, let's put a little bit of perspective on this. Before we get to this point, Gideon has seen an angel. He's seen God himself show up. He's seen a self-immolating sacrifice. He's had the whole testing thing with the fleece going on. He's a bit of a nobody, and his family backed him, even though they probably weren't going to. And the army has come out when he's called it, even though he's nobody, within the thing. And yet somehow, after all of that, he's still not keen for a fight. But he creeps down into the enemy camp. He listens to some idle soldier sitting next to the fire, and all of a sudden he's on. It's like, whoa, I listened to some soldier talk about his dream, and now we're in. You've got to ask the question, what's going on here? There's got to be something going on. Is it just me, or are you thinking that it's a pretty strange thing to be suddenly motivated by, considering everything else that has happened and that Gideon has seen? In fact, if you think about it, if you're too afraid to fight the Midianites, but you're okay to creep into the enemy camp, behind enemy lines, sneak up to the fireplace and listen to their conversation. Just not really taking a lot of sense here, is it? I mean, for a start, I don't think anyone's accusing Gideon of being a NASA scientist, but it just doesn't seem to wash, does it? Well, you've got to think, what's going on here? There's something else going on here beyond what just it appears on the surface. And surely hearing that dream was the least impressive of the ways that God has encouraged him so far. I mean, let's have a test of that. Just consider yourself. Think of these things. God showing up personally, an angel, a self-immolating sacrifice, the whole fleece thing, the army responding, and your family backing you, even though they're heathens because you've just destroyed all their idols, or some dream. Now, I don't know about you. I'm not rating. If we're playing, that game on TV where you got to order things in sort of price order, Right? It's not high on the list. It's going to be one of the lower prices here. The whole dream thing, you've got to say, just doesn't compare to, burning sacrifices and everything else going on. So surely it wasn't the dream. Just hearing this dream, there had to be more to it than that. And when you think about the detail of the dream, it even makes even less sense. The guy has a dream about a loaf of bread rolling into the camp and knocking over a tent. I mean, that's the dream. Now, the thing about barley bread, which we don't probably understand unless you're a baker, barley bread makes the least substantial loaf. So of all the loaves, it's the one you want to get hit with the most, because it'll just break apart the most, because it's not actually very substantial. So if we're in today's terms, we might say it would be a similar dream would be if a bag of fairy floss rolled down the hill and hit a tent and knocked it over. Right? That's the way the Israelites would be reading this. When they saw that and they heard that dream, they'd be thinking, man, that's a weird dream. And not only that, it's a ridiculous dream, clearly, but even more, you think about what the other soldier said and how he has interpreted and how he's reacted. This is what he says. Your dream can only mean one thing. Well, I don't know about you, but I can think of probably about 10 different meanings for that dream, one of which is he's eaten a little bit too much hummus. Righto, that's probably one option. Okay, there's a whole bunch of dreams. You could think, well, he's actually pointing out how pathetic the Israelites are. Or you could have taken it to mean that actually all they've got is, bread, and that all they're going to be able to do is knock down some tents, and other than that, you'll be fine. Yet there's any number of ways you could interpret that dream, I would say. But the soldier says, your dream can only mean one thing, and all is lost because of that. Well, no, the real value for Gideon isn't the dream itself. See, rather what's happened here is Gideon has at last realised the full nature of the task. Up until now, he's had God showing up and God doing miraculous things, but what he hasn't really understood is the true nature of the task. Listen to what this says. Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation. He bowed in worship before the Lord. Then he returned to the Israelite camp and shouted, get up, for the Lord has given you victory over the Midianite hordes. So what was the great revelation that he needed? It wasn't the dream itself. Clearly, that would be the least impressive of all the signs that Gideon had got. No, what was important for Gideon was actually not the dream, it was the interpretation of the dream. See, for Gideon, he had to finally see what he was up against. He was up against an army that was teetering on the edge of collapse. He was, regardless of what they've been doing, because of the work of the Lord, and how big they are, we're talking about a soldier who's surrounded by thousands and thousands and thousands of his own troops, who's going up against a reasonably small force compared to what they were against. And you can imagine it if in this case, this particular soldier was to say, someone has a dream and the soldier goes, oh no, we're all going to die. You can imagine it's probably unlikely in an army of that size, if it's healthy, that's going to happen. But clearly what Gideon has learned is that this army is ripe for the picking. This army, without him having to do a single thing, he hasn't even had to fight a battle yet. He hasn't there's not a single bit of blood being shed yet. And after he hears the interpretation, he has realised that in the minds of the enemy, they're already beaten. I mean, if they're even being scared by dreams about bread, then clearly he's in a pretty good place. You see, it didn't matter that he only had 300 men. In fact, when they eventually go to fight, they don't even take weapons in their hands. They take torches and horns. So it doesn't matter that he's only got 300 men. God hadn't been making it harder and harder and harder after all, like it looked like. No, actually, he didn't even need an army for what he was doing. God had already arranged for the victory. Remember what Gideon had said. God had said to Gideon. He said to this, his command to him was, go with the strength you have and rescue Israel from the Midianites, and I'll be with you, and you'll destroy the Midianites as if you're fighting against one man. Remember that right at the very beginning? That was his first command. All he needed all along was to be have faith. All he needed was faith in God's plan, something he's been sorely lacking all the way along despite all of the signs. The Midianites were all ready to give up. God had already dealt with that. He'd solved that problem. God had seen to that. Gideon didn't have to lift a sword to achieve that, but what he had to do was show up. Gideon had gone from the spring of trembling, where it seemed that God was just making it all harder and harder and harder, and he'd gone over to the hill of seeing God's purposes, where God had revealed the true weakness of his enemy. He'd finally seen now the job that he had to do. And if we have a look back, we realise that God actually gave him the choice. He didn't have to go up onto the hill. He didn't have to sneak into the Midianite camp. God says this to him. He says, get up and go into the Midianite camp, for I've given you victory over them. But if you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp. That's what God gives him a choice. God gave Gideon the choice of going straight to the attack if he wanted, because God, of course, knew what the hearts of the Midianite soldiers were, how they were going to react. Or he could risk a pretty risky journey behind enemy lines, you've got to say. I mean, think about what could have happened. He could have been captured. His servant could have been captured. He could have been killed. And what would have happened to the whole plan then? Clearly, he was putting at risk his whole plan because of his fear. God gave him the choice between fear and faith. That's essentially what he said to him. You can act in fear and go down to the camp and see what was going on there. It's not going to be an easy road, by the way. You're going to have to sneak behind enemy lines, and there's more of them down there than there are grains of the sand. You can go down there if you like. Or you can act in faith and attack straight away and trust that I've got the answer for you without having to learn it. Well, we know, of course, that Gideon chose the fear way, didn't he? He chose to go down. In fact, the trip to going down to the hill of seeing God's purposes was totally unnecessary, if he had had the faith to just do what God had told him from the very beginning. God Gideon be saying all the way along, show me signs, show me you mean what you say. All right, well, I sort of got that one, but I really need you to do this. And all the way along, he'd been asking for God for one more sign, give me one more sign, give me one more sign. But what would the account have looked like, do you think, if Gideon, right off the get-go, had put aside his fear and had acted out of faith? It probably would have been a lot shorter. I'm thinking the book of Judges has just lost about 2.5 chapters in the book. And it would have probably read something like this. God called Gideon, who immediately went with what strength he had, and he defeated the Midianites like they were only one man, because God was alongside him. And then they had peace, and he judged Israel for 40 years. That's probably would have been it. Probably a couple of verses, done and dusted. It'd be like Othniel, gets one verse. Or Shamgar gets one verse. All the good ones seem to get one verse. It's all these guys. Gideon gets 3 whole chapters. You really got to look at yourself when you've been devoted 3 chapters of the book of Judges. Right? Well, the same goes for us. What would our lives as disciples of Jesus look like if we chose more faith and chose less fear? Imagine if we loved God so much that we took the message of Jesus and we showed it in our own lives and we spoke it on our friends and family who didn't know him without fear of being called a Bible basher, because we knew that it was going to have an impact on their lives. What if we really believed that? Or maybe we would go and help someone, we go and help them out, knowing that that's what God commanded us to do and that we acted faithfully on that without the fear of thinking, what if I do this out something else? Or what if, they then want to be my friend and I don't really like them? Or imagine that. Imagine if it was acting out of faith rather than acting out of fear. Imagine if we were prepared to live God's way and not worry about the fact that society was going to tell us we're a bunch of freaks because we weren't doing certain things and we were doing certain things that society would tell us is wrong. Imagine a church full of Christians who made that choice. Now, I reckon we're actually starting to see a little bit of that in the church. This church, of course, has always seen things like that happen, but certainly I've just seen in the last couple of months, I've seen some people making some decisions for faith over fear. I'm really encouraged by that. In fact, you remember a couple of weeks ago we had a breakfast, or it was a brunch for a bunch of ladies who are involved in our church, a part of the outreach ministries that we do. Some of them are helpers, some of them are clients, and we invited them to come in. They aren't people that come to church and generally aren't interested, and they came to a brunch on a Saturday morning, and we had an opportunity to show them some love and some care and tell them how special they were to us, and they all loved it. Well, there was one particular lady in our church who went and invited someone who, to be honest, it was fully expected wouldn't come. In fact, when she sort of raised it with people, they tend to go, "Wow, you what? You what? Invited her? She's not going to come." And when I said to her, that was a good thing. And she said, "Well, God wouldn't have told me to invite her if he didn't intend for her to come." And guess what? She came. That's a person that chose faith over fear. Easily she could have thought, I'm not going to invite that person because she's just going to throw it back in my face, like she probably has done on a number of other occasions. But no, She chose faith. God is going to see this through, not fear. I think we're starting to see that sort of stuff in the church. In fact, this week we've had a bit of thing. I'm going to ask Warwick to come forward and give a bit of talk a little bit about what happened to him this week, about faith and fear. Come forward, mate. Over to you. It's always a danger when you hand someone else the microphone, but...
Thanks, Mick. Good morning, everyone. The last thing I expected this morning was to be standing here in front of you. As a matter of fact, I was a bit like Gideon because I feared getting up to tell this. This week, I'm a salesman, so I do a lot of travelling, and this week I was away in Rockhampton, and I left on Thursday morning very early to drive all the way back to Brisbane. And before I left, I put my trip in the Lord's hand, and I just asked for my guardian angels to go ahead of me and clear the road and just see me safely home. I've been on the road for about 9 hours, and I was coming down the Bruce Highway, 110 section. I was in the right-hand lane because the traffic next to me was pretty slow. As I got close to the overpass where you turn off to go to Steve Irwin Way, and any of you that are familiar with it, that road comes out and it actually joins back up to the main highway. There's like a merging lane. As I was going over the overpass, 2 words flashed through my head. I actually had a feeling of foreboding, and 2 words flashed through my head, and it was accident, intersection. And it gave me sufficient time to react, because what happened in 75 metres, no more ahead of me, a truck had run off the main highway. The car in front of me hit the brakes, and of course I had to hit the brakes as well. All I could see was the red lights of this car in front of me, and I was bearing down on it at an incredible rate, and it wasn't going anywhere, and I thought, this is it. The truck had kicked up a huge amount of dust, and I couldn't see a thing. And then suddenly, the car was gone. The dust had cleared. I got around it, and I was away. I could not believe it. I didn't think a lot about it. I thank God, but I didn't think a lot about it. I got home, got on with busyness, the whole bit. Got through the daily life on Friday. 11 o'clock on Friday night, I was in bed, and I had this revelation from God of Psalm 91. Before I went to bed on Wednesday night, this was the reading that I had before I went to bed. And I will read it to you, but there was a couple of words that God brought to my mind. Psalm 91. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. Surely He will save you from the fowler's snare and from the deadly pestilence. He will cover you with His feathers, and under His wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness will be your shield and rampart. You will not fear the terror at night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that stalks in the darkness, nor the plague that destroys at midday. 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you. You will only observe with your eyes and see the punishment of the wicked. If you make the Most High your dwelling, even the Lord, who is my refuge, then no harm will befall you, no disaster will come near your tent. For He will command His angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. They will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. You will tread upon the lion and the cobra. You will trample the great lion and the serpent. These next verses is what God brought to my mind on Friday night. Because He loves me, says the Lord, I will rescue him. I will protect him, for he acknowledges my name. He will call upon me, and I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will deliver him and honour him. With long life will I satisfy him and show him my salvation. Now, the feeling I got from God on Friday night was He wanted me to share this with you. And I had terrible trouble going to sleep that night. I woke up on Saturday, and that sort of feeling had passed, and I thought, I've imagined it. This morning, it came upon me again, and I rang Mick at 8:30 and said, Mick, this is what's happened, what do you think? He said, there's got to be something in this because it ties in with what I'm going to be preaching this morning about fear. I was humanly afraid of probably getting up and telling you this, but God had another reason for me to be here. And the revelation to me is this. This is the living word of God. We need to trust in this word. We need to walk with it in our life every day. We need to depend upon this because he is true. And this is as much a lesson for me as what I'm telling you, is to have faith in God, to trust in him every step of the way. And it reminds me too, something else that God revealed to me, and this is one of my favourite verses. It's in Isaiah chapter 41 and at verse 10. So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. I think what God's telling me and all of us is step out in faith. Do not fear, because he's with us. If God's for us, who can be against us? Nobody. So I just pray that this will be a blessing to you, because it certainly is to me. And I just thank God that I'm here to talk to you and to bring this to you. Thanks, Mick.
Yeah, good on you, mate. All right. Clearly God's doing something. Clearly God's doing something in amongst our midst. I reckon God is doing a work here in this church about stepping out in faith and going past fear. I think that's what he's doing. I think he's saying, okay, I'm going to use a whole bunch of different things, different experiences, the opportunities we have in our outreach ministries. He's saying it's time for us to step out in faith, not fear. But just in case you think that God's expecting a church full of super Christians, well, consider this. God answered every single request of Gideon for a sign. He didn't knock him back once, even though it was getting ridiculous. And I think at some point, the angel probably was holding back a backhand, I think, at a certain point. But God answered every request that Gideon gave. But he also gave him a choice. He could have chosen faith from the very beginning. But he understood, like God does with us, he understands that sometimes faith isn't what we have. What we have is fear. Sometimes we're at the spring of trembling. We're not on the hill of seeing God's purposes. God understands that. He gives us that choice. We've been having a look from the very start of Judges that God's purposes is going to occur regardless of what happens to us. That's what happens in the book of Judges. God's purposes continually are met all the way through. But what changes is the lives of the people that are within that plan. The choices that they make have an influence over the lives that they live. And that is one of the things of Judges. God can cope with us when we're in the spring of trembling. He's okay with that. He says, yep, I've got the heel of God, seeing God's purposes for you if you need it. But what he really desires, what he really wants, is the judge who just says, yep, I've taken it on faith. You told me, I'm into it, I'm going forward. That's what he's crying out for all through the book of Judges. And of course, as we know, actually he doesn't get too much of that. Do we want faith or do we want fear? It's a choice. It's not a choice to feel it. You can feel fear. I don't believe you can sit there and go, and I've been involved a bit around fear a few times, and I can tell you, you don't sit there and go, all right, I'm not going to be scared anymore. That's not the way fear works. But what can happen is you can overcome that fear through faith. You can step all over it with your faith.